2020 marks the 50th anniversary of the death of my father, the Austrian composer Franz Mittler. The piano works I will perform today will show his evolution as a composer over a 35-year time span from 1912 to 1947. Franz Mittler was born in 1893 when Vienna was still the center of the multi-ethnic Austrian Empire, and composers such as Brahms, Mahler, and Dvorak were active. He studied composition with associates of Brahms and piano with Leczetitsky, achieving recognition as a composer while still in his teens. His string quartets and cello sonata were performed by noted musicians, and his art songs and piano trio were featured by major music publishers, including his fantasy piece for piano. This work shows the influence of the character pieces by 19th century Romantic composers such as Schumann and Brahms, and expresses the emotional intensity of a young, passionate composer. Now I will perform Franz Mittler's fantasy piece for piano, which he composed in Vienna in 1912 at the age of 18. A lyrical opening section is contrasted with a stormy middle section and returns to conclude the work. The start of the First World War in 1914 brought an abrupt end to his musical activities. He spent the next 4 years in the Austrian army as a lieutenant in charge of a bread baking unit and was unable to study, practice, or compose. When he returned to civilian life in 1918 at the age of 25, Vienna was no longer the center of an empire, but instead the head of a small, impoverished country. The cultural world of 19th century Romanticism had passed, and publishers and composers were experimenting with new styles. After working as a conductor in Germany, my father established a new career in Vienna as a noted piano accompanist for leading singers. In addition to composing many art songs, he also achieved fame as a published author of humorous verses such as spoonerisms and limericks. In 1926, 3 of his humorous piano selections were published in Vienna. The first one, Niccolo and Krampus, is based on an Austrian Christmas legend in which the Holy Saint Nicholas is accompanied by the devilish Krampus who punishes the bad children. In his musical setting of the legend, Franz Mittler portrays Saint Niccolo in a hymn-like reverential opening section, which is followed by a faster, noisier, and dissonant middle section representing Krampus. The piece ends with both Nicolo's and Krampus-like themes combined.
The next humorous selection is titled Humoresque and was dedicated to a modern dancer. One can almost picture the dancer leaping in the air and running across the stage.
The third of the humorous selections is Little Nana's music box, dedicated to Nana, his piano student. He portrays the music box being wound up and uses the upper register of the piano to capture the tinkling sound of the music box. By the end of the piece, the music box runs down and has to be rewound before the work concludes. In December 1938, Franz Mittler emigrated to America. Because of his close musical association with the noted Austrian satirist Karl Kraus and his Jewish ancestry, he couldn't safely return to his apartment in Vienna from a concert tour after the Nazis had annexed Austria in March of 1938. While his housekeeper in Vienna was able to save many of his smaller manuscripts, several of his larger works were lost in the turmoil of World War II. In the early 1940s, he joined a group of 4 pianists called the First Piano Quartet, which toured throughout the United States. They had a weekly radio broadcast on NBC, recorded for RCA Victor, and even appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. He also made many educational arrangements and composed original teaching pieces for music court publications in the 1940s and early 50s, while he lived with his family in Kew Gardens in Queens. He had met my mother, a fellow refugee who had been a piano student of his in Vienna, by accident in the Steinway building in Manhattan. They married in the municipal building, and I came along a few years later while they were still living in Washington Heights. In 1947, Franz Mittler composed a set of 10 short pieces for music court publications called the Manhattan Suite, which portrayed a variety of sites and neighborhoods in the city. I will perform 5 of these selections for you. The first is called Waltzing in Central Park, although I think it could have been easily called Waltzing in the Vienna Woods. The next two selections show two ethnic areas in Manhattan, including Chinatown and the Lower East Side with its Eastern European Jewish immigrants. The last two selections include the lively Song of the Subway and a slow jazz-influenced selection called Farewell to New York. To conclude, I would like to add another teaching piece he composed called Bolero in Blue, which he dedicated to me. In his final years, Franz Mittler returned to Europe and lived in Bavaria, close to Salzburg in Austria. He served as a vocal coach in the Summer Academy of the Mozarteum and passed away in December 1970 from complications of Parkinson's disease. After his death, the Mozarteum sent me many scores of his compositions, which I have had the pleasure of performing and recording throughout the years.